Picture a shoreline that is handing you four different answers at the same time, and at least one of them is lying to you. A steady wind is pushing chop into the near bank. Off to the left, a culvert is fanning brown runoff into the lake after last night's rain. And the clouds have just cracked open, so half the flat is lit up like a parking lot while the rest of it sits in shade. 4 clues, 4 places to start, and the one your eye lands on before your brain catches up is always that brown water, because it is the only thing out there that looks like it changed. So before you commit a cast to it, you spend 40 seconds. Drop a cheap thermometer over the side and read the lake. Then walk down to the pipe and read the water coming out of it. The lake reads 78. The runoff reads 69. And just like that, the loudest clue on the shoreline became the one I trust least. I'll explain exactly why in a few minutes. And I think it will change how you fish rain for good. This is not another list of weather tips. You already have those. What almost nobody hands you is an order, a ranking that tells you which clue to believe when 2 of them point at opposite ends of the lake. That is the real problem out there. Not that you have no information, that you have too much of it, and no way to sort it. By the end of this, I'll give you the order I trust weather clues in, from the one that settles every argument down to the one I've learned to nearly ignore, and I'll tell you where we're headed now so you can watch it happen. The most dramatic clue on the lake is almost never the most useful one. Start with the wind, because wind is the clue most anglers get right for the wrong reason. You already know the idea. Wind pushes the surface carries drifting food, the food piles into the bank the wind blows into, and the little fish follow it, and the bigger fish follow them. That chain is real. I've watched it hold up on more lakes than I can count. Here is the part that gets skipped. Wind does not move water anywhere near as fast as it looks like it does. Under a steady wind, the surface drift beneath it runs at something like 1 to 3% of the wind speed. So a 15-mile-an-hour wind is not shoving a 15-mile-an-hour river across your lake. It is nudging the top layer along at a walking pace. That matters, because a food line takes time to build, and the wind that came up while you were rigging your rod has not built one yet. Which is why the wind that has been blowing since yesterday is worth 10 times the wind that started an hour ago. Same direction on the app, completely different lake. Toss something that floats out past the first break and watch it for 10 seconds, and you will see where the surface is really going. Now here is the first place 2 clues collide. The wind says fish the far bank. You walk down there and the water is clean. The chop is slapping the rocks. Everything the rule promised. And there is not one baitfish in it. Not a flick, not a swirl, nothing. Meanwhile, the calm bank behind you, the easy one you were taught to skip, has bait dimpling along a weed edge in the flat water. Trust the bait. Every time. The wind rule is a prediction about where food should have collected. The baitfish are a report about where food actually is. When a prediction and a report disagree, you take the one that is already true. That is the first rung of a ladder we are building, and I want you to feel it work before I name it. Move to light, because sun and shade is where anglers make the fastest wrong decision on the water. The clouds break, the flat lights up, and every one of us has the same reflex. Get to the shade, find the dock, the laydown, the overhanging willow, and fish the dark side of it. And that reflex is usually right, for a simple reason. Bright, flat light in clear water strips the ambush away from a predator. A fish that can be seen as easily as it can see has lost its advantage, so it slides toward anything that gives that edge back. Here is a free way to read how strong the effect is right now. Look at your own shadow. Hard, crisp edge means the light on that water is hard too, and the shade lines under the surface are sharp and worth fishing. Soft or vague shadow means the shade advantage is weak, and the fish are not stacked on those edges nearly as tightly. But now let me break the reflex, because this is the second collision. Same bright afternoon. You are ready to go dissect a dock, and out in the open chop, 40 yards from any shade at all, bait is showering. Little sprays of it, over and over, in the same 50-foot stretch. The light says shade, the bait says open water, and again, the bait wins. That broken, wind-riffled surface is doing the same job the shade was doing. It scatters the light before it reaches the fish. The dock gives you a small, obvious piece of low-light water. The chop can give you an acre of it, and almost nobody fishes it because it does not look like cover. So the rule holds, but the rule was never about shade. It was about light. Shade is one way to get low light. Wind is another. Now let's talk about what you can actually see through, because this is where most anglers are flying blind. We describe water in words. Clear, stained, dirty, chocolate milk. Those words fall apart the moment you try to compare today to last Tuesday. There is a fix that costs about $1, and biologists have used the same trick for over 150 years. A white disc on a marked string. You lower it until it disappears, and you write down the depth. That is the whole instrument. State agencies run volunteer programs where ordinary people on ordinary lakes take that reading week after week, and those readings become the official record of the water. A dinner plate and a piece of string, taken seriously. So why should a fisherman care about a number like that? Because visibility is not just about whether a fish can find your lure. It changes what kind of lure a fish can successfully catch. In controlled tank work, researchers offered largemouth bass the same mix of prey at different levels of cloudiness. As the water got murkier, the bass did not simply eat less of everything. Their preferences shifted. Fast-moving fish prey got harder to run down, and the slower, easier targets started getting picked more often. Push the murk high enough and the whole feeding rate falls off. I want to be careful, because this is the kind of finding that gets turned into a magic number it was never meant to be. That was a tank, not your lake. There is no threshold to memorize and no gadget to buy. The takeaway is a direction, not a formula. As visibility drops, a predator's reach shrinks, and fast gets harder to catch than slow. So when your disc comes back saying 8 inches instead of 4 feet, that is the lake telling you your lure needs to be slower, closer, and easier to commit to. Which brings us back to the brown water from the beginning. This is the part I most want you to keep. Here is what every one of us does. Rain comes through, a creek starts pumping, and a brown fan spreads into the lake. It is the most obvious change on the shoreline, so we fish the edge of it, where dirty meets clean, because that seam looks like a wall a fish would sit behind. Sometimes that is exactly right. Sometimes it is the best spot on the lake. But there is a question nobody asks first, and it decides everything. Is that incoming water warmer than the lake or colder? Because that plume does not have to stay on the surface. Water gets denser as it cools, and a load of suspended sediment makes it denser still. So when a creek runs into a lake, one of 3 things happens. If the inflow is warmer, it is lighter, and it rides along the top, and that brown fan really is the whole story. But if the inflow is colder and heavier than the lake, it does not spread across the surface at all. It runs out, reaches a point where it can no longer stay on top, and it dives. Engineers who model reservoirs call that spot the plunge point. Below the plunge point, that water keeps going as a layer you cannot see. If it is only a little heavier, it slides in at the depth that matches its own density and travels through the lake as a sheet. If it is a lot heavier, it hugs the bottom and runs downhill. Which means on the right day, the brown water you are casting at is a shell. The nutrients, the washed-in food, the temperature change, the thing that actually rearranged the fish, that already went underneath, and it is moving through water that looks completely ordinary from where you're standing. And this is not a rare curiosity. It follows a rough seasonal rhythm. In spring, streams tend to warm faster than the big body of water they run into, so inflows more often ride on top. In late summer and into fall, streams often cool faster than the lake, so plunging inflows become far more common. Does it happen every time? No. It depends on the temperature difference, the sediment load, how the bottom drops off, and how hard the creek is running. A trickle behaves differently than a flood, which is why the thermometer is not optional. 2 readings, 40 seconds, and you know which of the 3 situations you are standing in. If the inflow is warmer than the lake, fish the visible plume the way you always have. Work the color seam, keep it shallow, and treat that edge as the feeding line. If the inflow is clearly colder, Stop treating the brown fan as the target and start treating it as an arrow. Follow the direction it is pushing, get out past where the visible stain quits, and put your bait down along the first real depth change out there. The bottom bend, the old creek channel, the point that drops. You are no longer fishing a color, you are fishing where that hidden layer is being steered. And you confirm it the same way you confirm everything else. Not with a theory, with a cast. Which brings me to the piece I think separates people who read water from people who just look at it. A fish that follows your lure and turns away has not failed you. It has just voted. Think about what that follow eliminated. The fish are here, so location is answered. The fish saw the lure, so visibility is answered. The fish left cover to look, so willingness is answered. 3 questions gone, from 1 refusal. The only thing left is the presentation. So that is the one variable you change, by itself, on the very next cast, to the very same spot. Same lure, same lane, same target. You slow the part where it turned, or you add a pause right there. 1 variable, 1 cast, 1 clean answer. I've watched anglers do the opposite for years. Fish follows, angler reties, changes color, moves down the bank, and throws away the best information they got all day. Here is the version that catches people off guard. The water is cold, and everything you have read says go slow, so you go slow, and a fish comes up, tracks it, and drifts off. Then a bass smokes the same lure while you are ripping it back to make another cast. The rule said slow. The fish said fast. Take the fish. Cold water does not enforce one's speed. It shifts the odds. And an actual strike from an actual fish in the actual water you are standing in outranks any rule ever printed, including the good ones. One more thing to look for, because it hides in plain sight on every windy lake in the country. Those long, parallel lines of foam and debris stretching across open water. Most people read them as trash, or as a sign the lake is dirty. They are neither. They are seams. Wind working across the surface can organize the water underneath into long, rolling tubes lying parallel to the wind, and where 2 of those tubes meet, the surface pulls together and sinks. Anything floating gets herded into that line and held there, and the downward pull under the foam is stronger than the gentle rise in between. That is a conveyor, marked out for you in white, and it collects the drifting stuff small fish eat. Researchers still argue about the fine details of how these lines form, but you do not need the physics settled to use the pattern. They are the most reliable current line on an open lake, and they cost nothing to find. So let me put the ladder together, because you have already climbed most of it without me naming it. At the top, above everything, is a direct response from a fish. A strike, a follow, a tap, a swirl, a hard refusal. That is not evidence about the lake. That is the answer. 1 step down is biological evidence you can see. Bait fish flicking, birds working, bugs on the surface. Fish have to eat, and the food is already voting on where they will be. Below that is physical change in the water. Current, visibility, a color boundary, a temperature difference, a shade line, an inflow, drift direction. These do not tell you where the fish are. They tell you where to look for the 2 rungs above. Below that is the recent weather trend. 3 hot days, a week of cooling, how long the wind has blown, when the rain actually fell. Good for narrowing the lake down before you get there. And at the bottom, the weakest evidence you own is the icon on your phone and the old rhyme somebody taught you at the ramp. Not worthless. Just outranked by everything above it. There is a product for almost every rung near the bottom of that ladder, and very little for the top, mostly because a follow and a refusal cannot be packaged. Now let me put the whole thing to work, because I want you to try to beat me to the answer. Late August. You pull up to a shoreline you know well, and 4 clues hit you at once. Your phone says the day is a write-off. Hot, high sun, wind falling off, everything it labels bad. The wind that did blow all morning has been pushing into the north bank, so the rule says go there. There is a creek arm on the south side still running dirty from a storm 2 nights ago, and that brown water is the most obvious thing on the lake, and the flat in front of you is bright, clean, and looks empty. Start at the bottom of the ladder and throw the weakest clue out first. The app's opinion is not evidence. It goes. Next, the wind. You walk the north bank and it is exactly what the rule promised. Chop on the rocks, a food line building. But there is no bait in it. Not one flick in 10 minutes of looking. The prediction failed to produce a report, so the wind gets downgraded. Now the brown water, and this is the trap. You are already reaching for the rod. Instead, you spend 40 seconds. Lake, 84. Creek, 75. 9 degrees colder. Which means that visible plume is a shell, and whatever came in with that storm has already gone under. You are looking at the wrapper. So you stop casting at the stain and start reading the direction it is being pushed. You follow it out to where the color quits, and right there, where the flat rolls off into the old channel bend, the water looks like nothing at all. Then you see it. 2, 3 little sprays of bait over that drop. Nothing loud. Just enough. Biological evidence. In ordinary-looking water, 30 yards past the clue everybody else on the lake is casting at. You drop the disc. Barely a foot of visibility down there. So you do not throw something fast and far. You put it close, keep it slow, and let it stay in front of them. First cast, a fish follows to the boat and turns. And you already know what that follow just did, don't you? Location, answered. Sight, answered. Willingness, answered. So you make the exact same cast. Same lure, same lane, same target. And this time, over the top of that channel bend, you stop it. The line jumps sideways. The weather app was wrong. The wind was a false lead. The muddy water was a decoy. And a 9-degree difference and 3 flicks of bait were the whole story. That is the skill. Not knowing more weather. Knowing what to believe first. So here is the thing I want you carrying out of here, short enough to keep in your head at the ramp. Weather suggests. Water narrows it down. Bait confirms it. The fish get the final vote. Suggest, narrow, confirm, vote. Work it in that order, and you stop guessing at a lake and start interviewing it. Quick word before you go. If you can hear thunder, you are close enough to be hit, so get off the water and let the fish wait. Give heavy runoff room, because banks undercut and storm current is stronger than it looks. If an inflow smells wrong or is carrying obvious pollution, leave it alone. And check your state and local regulations before you fish it, because access rules and seasons are not the same everywhere. Go back to that first shoreline one more time. The wind, the brown fan, the sun breaking through. 4 answers at once. Nothing about that water changed while you stood there. The only thing that changed is that you now know which of the 4 to ask first. And I'd like to know where you land on this, because I don't think everybody will agree with me. I'll say plainly that fishing a visible mudline is advice that is wrong more often than it is right in late summer, and that most anglers would catch more by walking past it. So tell me in the comments, have you ever taken the temperature of an inflow against the lake, and what did you find? And what is the one weather rule you were taught that your own water has proven wrong? The best answers on this channel always come from the people who went and checked,